Some people prefer to live in a house, while others feel that there are more advantages to living in an apartment. Are there more advantages than disadvantages of living in a house compared with living in an apartment? That's the question we're going to look at today. And as usual, I want you to think about the usual process that we go through. First of all, identifying the question type. What type of question is this? Hopefully you can see that this is more of a opinion discussion task. Now, in the video course, in Mastering IELTS Writing Task 2, we talk about discussion opinion tasks, opinion discussion tasks, as if they were the same thing. But really, we need to talk about an important difference, and that is the difference between discussion opinion and opinion discussion. It doesn't sound like much of a difference at all, and that's because it's not a big difference, but there is a slight difference. So I'm going to first of all write this in. This is opinion and discussion. Opinion, discussion. The reason that I'm saying this is because we are going to treat the format of this essay just like we would a discussion opinion task. We're going to start the body with the side that we disagree with, so to speak, and then in the second body paragraph we're going to move on to the side that we agree with, so to speak. But it's not really a case of agreeing or disagreeing here. Instead, we're really just being asked for our own opinion. We're not being asked about anybody else's point of view. But at the same time, we need to come up with an essay that looks at two sides, if that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense yet, it should become clear in a moment when we go through the plan and speak about some ideas. And it should become clear perhaps as well when we have a look at the key words. That's our second step as usual. We want to highlight the key words. So let's have a look here and see what we think. Hopefully, when you look at this, you realize the main topic here is about where people live, and we're picking out two kinds of accommodation: living in a house, so a house versus a apartment or a flat, depending on how you want to term it. So apartment, and then of course we want advantages. To get more advantages. That's the idea here. The more advantages living in a house than living in an apartment. And and let's just go back and highlight that. Are there more advantages than disadvantages of living in a house? There you go. But this is quite important. Compared with living in an apartment. I'm going to highlight that compared with there because it's very, very important in terms of task response and making sure that we address all parts of the task for a reason that will become clear in a moment. But those are our keywords that we're thinking about here. Basically, the advantages and disadvantages of living in a house compared with, there's that key expression, living in an apartment. And just like with a discussion opinion task, we need to think about our own opinion. We need to come up with our position on this. Are there more advantages than disadvantages, or are there not? Are there more disadvantages than advantages? For me, I think that living in a house comes with more advantages. So my view is that there are more advantages than disadvantages of living in a house compared with living in an apartment. Because of that, how do you think I'm going to plan my essay? What am I going to speak about in the body paragraphs? Well, you may look at this in two regards here. You could either talk about flats in one paragraph and houses in the other paragraph, but if you look at the question, it's not really saying are houses better than flats or apartments, but it's saying are there more advantages than disadvantages of living in a house? And so the main topic here is based on houses. So ideally, instead of writing about apartments in one paragraph and then houses in another paragraph, we'll instead look at advantages of living in a house in one paragraph and disadvantages of living in a house in another paragraph. And we'll use apartments in both of those paragraphs to provide contrast and context to make sure that we're still making comparisons like the task asks us to. So if I think there are more advantages of living in a house, then I'm probably going to start, just like a discussion opinion format, we start with the weaker side. I'm going to start by talking about the disadvantages. In the second body paragraph, the side that I'm leaning more towards will be the advantages. But as I said, we do want to make sure that we are referring to apartments as well, but they are there to provide context and contrast. They are not the central purpose of the essay, which is mostly based on houses. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So now we've got to think of some ideas, and this isn't too difficult. When it comes to these sort of opinion discussion essays, we're looking at advantages and disadvantages. You just got to come up with some good things and some bad things about living in a house. So if we first of all think about the negatives of a house, one for me is security. I always think about security when it comes to living in a house. Of course, you know, you can have locks on your house front door and all this sort of stuff, but in general, houses tend to be less secure. And why is that? That will be our support sentence. The reason for that is that, usually houses are only protected by a lock, maybe a double lock or whatever. So usually only locks involved, instead of things that flats have, which we will come to later to provide context. Instead of talking about it in this sentence, we'll come to it later. So that's our support. Any other reasons why houses tend to be less secure? Instead of what they have, what they don't have. It could be, this would be like an extra support sentence here, like in addition. It could be that many houses are not very high up. They're not very tall. If you contrast this with apartment blocks, they tend to be very high. That makes a deterrent to criminals. So we can talk about them being only 1 or 2 stories high. Now notice the spelling of the word stories there. It's different from like storybook, which would be IES. Story is spelt with an E in the middle there, if we think about floors. Okay, then what we can do now is provide that contrast. We can address that need to compare. So here is where we look at the alternative and we talk about flats. Well, flats or apartments, however you want to look at them, they tend to be more secure. Why do they appear more secure? Well, we can say that that's because, which is a support sentence, this is because they tend to have cameras, particular kind of camera we'll look at later, cameras, security guards, and more stories. It's to be a lot taller. So just by thinking of your initial idea, that immediately can give you the idea for apartments as well. So you don't actually have to think about all that much, but you're addressing all parts of the task. We'll do the same thing with advantages. First of all, we've got to think of an advantage. What's one of the main positives? Well, I think probably the first one that comes to most people's minds is that houses tend to be more spacious. There's a lot more space involved. They tend to be a bit larger, don't they? On top of that, I'm going to put 2 here. There's also more privacy involved. Now, there's a reason that I'm looking at 2 together here, and that is because the question is really asking us, are there more advantages than disadvantages? And so by including 2 advantages, we can quite clearly say with evidence that there are more. It's 2 to 1, 2 advantages and 1 disadvantage. So that can be quite helpful there. However, the problem with writing 2 together is that it can be a bit tricky to then follow up with a support sentence that addresses each item, because you don't really want to look at 2 together. You don't want to put a support sentence that looks at both together, but it's good if you continue separating the ideas. So what we're going to do when we get there is we're just going to say with regards to the former. I'm not going to write that in here, but I'm just going to write S1 and then S2 to think about each one. So with regards to the former, space, houses tend to have, let's say, multiple rooms. Usually quite a lot of rooms in contrast with flats. And then if we think about the second point that I made about privacy, that can be because, well, a lot of houses are detached. They're not wall to wall with other accommodation, and as a result the noise that you make doesn't leak through. So we can think about detached houses and noise, basically. And then just like before, we're going to contrast that with apartments. apartments tend to have fewer rooms. They tend to be smaller, basically, not all the time. That's a very important part of this essay. We're going to talk about in more detail later. Not all the time. Not all flats are smaller than all houses. So they tend to be smaller. That's one thing. So it's almost like the A1 here, and then sort of an A2 where we look at the privacy aspect. The walls are all adjoining. We'll say that neighbours live in close proximity is a nice collocation that we can use. Okay, so there's our plan. The nice thing here, as I mentioned, and I'm going to mention again, you really only need to come up with ideas for houses, because apartments, you just look at the opposite. So your advantage of a house is your disadvantage of an apartment, and vice versa. So we can now use this to help us write our response. Now, when it comes to questions where you're confronted with a choice, which you could reasonably take either way, then a very good way to begin your essay is with "it is important to consider." Notice that this is, like I say, when you're confronted with a choice. It's not really a case for arguments. It can sometimes work with arguments, but with choices it's a lot simpler. Let's have a look at how it works here. It is important to consider, and then consider what you're choosing between. What is the category of choice? For instance, if the question was something like, some people prefer to take science-related courses, whereas other people prefer to take humanities-related courses, which one has more advantages, disadvantages, etc., you could start with, it is important to consider which type of university course is most beneficial for students. If you were talking about the choice between whether people should drive to work or whether they should cycle, we could say it is important to consider which type of transport people should use on their commute. So in those two cases, we looked at university courses, category 1, and transport, category 2. If you look at this here, what would be the category title, do you think? Houses and apartments. Hopefully, you can think about the word accommodation, and we can slot that in just the same type of sentence. It is important to consider which type of accommodation people should live in. Okay, there we go. We can make that just a little bit stronger by moving the word people to a more appropriate location. At the moment, we're saying that we're almost choosing on behalf of other people, but really we want to say that all people should think about this for themselves. So it might be better if we just slot this over here. It is important for people to consider which type of accommodation they should live in. Okay, that works a little bit better. This just helps to set up our position. Without this sentence, it's a little bit more difficult to set up the position in a nice, cohesive way. You don't have to have this sentence though. If you think you can write the introduction without this sentence, then by all means, give it a try. It can work if you think hard enough about it. But this does make it a little bit easier for us, because we can just say this essay will explain why I believe the drawbacks of living in a house are outweighed by the benefits. Oh, I've already got benefits, so let's say positives when compared to life in an apartment. So maybe we don't even need that second sentence, but if you have enough speed, I think it's quite good to just provide a slightly less abrupt opening, kind of guides and eases the reader into the essay a bit more. So this third sentence, let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. This essay will explain why I believe, good, we've got a clear position here, that's important. When they say, are there more advantages than disadvantages? This is not an objective truth, it is your opinion. So we need to make sure we use some opinion language. Now notice up here, they've got, are there more? And we've kind of swapped this around, and we've started with the drawbacks, and by doing that we can actually bring in the passive voice here as well. The drawbacks are outweighed by the positives. We've also made sure to include paraphrasing of compared with here, we've got when compared to life in an apartment. So we're making sure that we're addressing all parts of the task appropriately. Yes, it's maybe a slightly longer introduction than usual, and yes, you probably could get away with deleting that sentence there. I'm going to leave it in, but if you are worried about speed, you could think about how you could reduce the time you spend by just writing those 2 sentences instead of 3. Okay, let's move into the first body paragraph. And we know that we want to look at the disadvantages first, so let's make sure that we start the paragraph by clearly identifying the theme and the topic of the paragraph. So we'll say, maybe considering firstly, a nice expression to use, considering firstly the negatives, can't type today, the negatives of houses. You could say of living in a house, of life in a house, but I'm just worried that it will turn into quite a bit of repetition, so I'm going to leave that out there. But important comma there, following the cohesive device, the opening. An important one. Notice the one here. Be careful with the way that you use the word one. We can use one to refer to a negative here. So one of the negatives, if you can say it like that, it probably works. An important one is that this style, form, kind of accommodation is less secure. So we've got security, less secure. Now, can you see if I've done anything wrong in this sentence? And it may not be grammar related, it may be task response related. Something that I mentioned before, hopefully you've remembered it, there's an issue when we write this. Is less secure. Is that all the time? Don't think so. Some houses are incredibly secure, more secure than some apartment blocks. So it's very important that we avoid that by bringing in language like tends to be. Tends to be. So this kind of accommodation tends to be less secure. So we can drop that out there. So considering firstly the negatives of houses, an important one is that this kind of accommodation tends to be less secure. Why is that the case? We can say this is because, usual starts here. You don't even need this, but it's nice to add it in. This is because the vast majority of houses, and I feel quite secure saying this, like quite confident, it's not an overgeneralization, I think it's generally the truth. The vast majority of houses are only protected by a single or double lock. So we've got some nice topic related vocabulary in here. Single lock, double lock, talking about accommodation, security and that sort of thing. On the front door, again, more topic related vocabulary, collocations. On top of that, there's sometimes a particular alarm system as well. We call this a burglar alarm, so I'm going to add that in as well. But this is less common. So instead of vast majority, I'm going to write with occasionally burglar alarm inside. And I'm talking about my house here. My house has a burglar alarm, but we very rarely use it. So we can even include that as well. So with occasionally a rarely used burglar alarm inside, a rarely operated, a rarely activated. This is a good way of showing word formation here, where you join a frequency adverb to a verb in the past participle here, and it becomes a nice kind of singular adjective in a way. So a rarely used burglar alarm inside. Now, my plan says we've got a little bit more to say. It's like an additional point, so we're going to write a furthermore. And we're talking about stories. So houses are usually, and in an essay like this, you need lots of frequency adverb. Tend to, often, usually, normally. Make sure you have a good backup of these frequency adverbs because you don't want to repeat yourself if you can avoid it. So usually only 1 or 2 stories high. And why is that important? Don't just finish the sentence like that. Explain why that matters. We can say this here with a non-defining relative clause, which is low down enough for a burglar to see through, not only that, see through and enter via a window. So that's a big problem there. So we're really kind of building up the idea. We're creating a visual image for the reader. Now, if we move over to the alternative here, you can see that we've got apartments to talk about now. So we can say this. We can say contrast this, as in contrast all of this here, with apartment blocks. Again, we're going to use another non-defining relative clause where you say another which. It's okay that it's a similar kind of sentence. They're quite different in their structure, really. So contrast this with apartment blocks, which are frequently, again, not always, but frequently equipped with, now, I asked you, these types of cameras, what are they called? Cameras which look at you. They've got a name, begins with an SURV, surveillance cameras. So surveillance cameras, security guards, and probably a few other things as well. I can't think of anything specific, but I am going to write something that shows off my vocabulary. So we're going to say other forms of criminal deterrence. So sometimes it's good if you don't think of another example, but you instead think about the category which can be used to define all of the examples, and then you put that on the end instead. That's a good example of doing that there.